It's one thing to know the rules of a game. It's another thing entirely to know how to use the rules of that game to win. In Lorcana, there are two main things your characters can do on your turn: quest and challenge. Questing gives you lore, which is what you need to claim victory. Challenging deals damage to opposing characters, potentially banishing them. However, a character can't do both on a turn. You have to choose. There is, of course, the trivial case. If there are no opposing characters, you can only quest, so do that. Or if a character is reckless, then clearly they can only challenge. But there isn't really a decision to be made in those cases. What's more important are the non-trivial cases. The key thing to keep in mind is that you win by gaining lore, not by banishing opposing characters. You could challenge every single character your opponent plays and it won't matter if you never quest. So, naively, you might conclude that you should only quest and never challenge, but you'll run into problems if your opponent is able to play either more characters than you or higher lore characters than you. Then you're stuck in a race that you will just slowly lose. The key thing to realize is that it's not just about gaining lore, it's about gaining lore faster. Every action you take should be in the service of you reaching 20 lore before your opponent does. A good heuristic to measure this is to compare the lore output of your board with the lore output of your opponent, as well as to compare your current lore totals, or rather, the lore each of you need to reach 20. We'll call this the lore distance. If your lore output matches your lore distance, simply quest and take your win. If not, we need to get a bit more mathy. Given your current board, how many turns would you need just questing to meet your lore distance? And how many turns would your opponent need? Let's call these numbers your countdowns. If your countdown is smaller than your opponent's, you should probably be questing. If your countdown is larger, then you should probably be challenging. But of course, you can only challenge exerted characters. This fact incentivizes pillow fort strategies. That is, just playing lots of characters until your lore output is at or near 20, then swinging out for a one-turn win. Ideally, you try to deal with them through actions and abilities like Dragonfire and Elsa Snow Queen, but let's assume for now that all you have are vanilla characters. It might seem hopeless if someone is pillow forting and has more lore output than you. You have no way to challenge them and banish their characters. But if they're not questing, they're not gaining lore. So you should be questing yourself. Remember, it's not about who can get 20 lore worth of characters onto the board at once. It's about who can get 20 lore. Period. If your opponent is pillow forting, it's because they don't want you to challenge them, which means it's likely that you have stronger characters. If you quest, you're putting win pressure on them and forcing them to either start questing themselves to catch up or challenge your characters. In those cases, you can likely make favorable trades, either because they'll need to use multiple characters to take out one of yours, or because you can use a higher willpower character to take out one of their high lore characters in response to them questing. Another thing to keep in mind are high-value characters. Pascal, Rapunzel's companion, becomes evasive if he's with another character, so if you ever catch him exerted and alone, you should probably take him out while you have the chance. Aurora, Dreaming Guardian, gives the rest of her friends ward, and if a player can get 2 copies out, that means the entire opposing board cannot be touched by actions or abilities. So try to take her out so you can use non-challenge options on everyone else. Beyond characters with cool abilities, who should you target for challenges? Well, try to use low lore characters against high lore characters. Low lore characters will typically have higher strength and willpower, making it a more favorable trade, as your character will likely survive. If you have challenger characters, use those first, as that's the whole reason they're in your deck to begin with. They're high strength and offense. The goal of a challenge should be to have a relative increase in your lore output compared to your opponent. Using Goon's Maleficent's underlings in a challenge will lose you 1 lore output if they're banished, but if they take out Aurora Regal Princess, your opponent will have lost 2 lore output, so relative to them, you've actually gained 1 lore. Remember, you want to have a lower lore countdown than your opponent, so make trades with that in mind. Let's say your opponent has a lore output of 5 and a lore distance of 15. They're at 5 lore currently. That makes their lore countdown 3. You have 10 lore, thus a lore distance of 10, but you only have 3 lore output, so your countdown is 4. Remember to round up. In that case, you want to challenge where possible, even though you're ahead in lore. If you can drop their lore output below yours, that will put you ahead, whereas just questing and trying to race them will likely result in a loss. Certain character abilities can incentivize one choice over the other. Emerald characters tend to emphasize win pressure tactics, forcing your opponent to challenge and make bad trades. Cruella de Vil, Miserable as Usual, and Cheshire Cat Not All There have strong effects when they are challenged and banished, so you almost always want them to quest. Conversely, Ruby characters have abilities to encourage challenging. Mulan Imperial Soldier and Aladdin Heroic Outlaw both have abilities that let you net more lore when challenging and successfully banishing an opposing character than when they quest normally. If you're on the receiving end of those Ruby characters, those should be high priority targets to take out with challenges. One thing to keep in mind is that challenging is not an offensive or aggressive strategy. It's actually defensive. The aggro strategy is questing because the game is won off of lore, not damage. An aggro deck wants to run lots of cheap high lore characters, but those characters are going to be lacking in strength and willpower, so the defensive deck is going to run lower lore characters that can take out the small ones and stick around to quest themselves. Rush is a defensive keyword, letting you slide out a high strength character to take out an opposing high lore character that just quested. Same for Elsa's Snow Queen, letting you challenge characters that are either pillow forting or were just played. Are there times to neither quest nor challenge? If you have a high lore character that will easily be taken out by an opposing challenge, and your countdown is still lower than your opponent's without them, then it's probably safer to keep them ready and force your opponent to challenge into your stronger characters. However, ready characters can still be hit by actions, so when facing a steel player with lots of removal, you may as well just quest with them anyway. And of course, characters can sing and use abilities, which is a whole other complication on top, which would merit its own video. If you take anything away from this video, try to minimize your lore countdown while maximizing your opponent's. All quests and challenges should be made within that paradigm, barring exceptional character abilities.